Friends, please, we are just a moment or two away from getting started with Senator Cornyn and Will Inboden. So if you could please go ahead and take your seats, and please come, don't be shy, come up here to the front where there's plenty of room, or perhaps if you're sitting further back, you could squeeze a little bit toward the middle. We should have plenty of seats, though, to accommodate everyone. Thanks so much. Thanks for being here, and we'll get going in just another minute.
Siempre voy pensando en ti, y me lleno de alegría.
All right. So, get my notes out here. All right. So, okay, everyone, thank you for coming together here with us. Hope you enjoyed your lunch, and we've certainly had a feast of intellectual stimulation, our first few panels this morning. And with all due respect to those who have gone before, I'm very honored to be up here with the highlight of our day in so many ways, which is a chance to have a conversation with Senator John Cornyn. You, in your conference materials, of course, you have his full bio, so I won't go over everything on that. But there's a few things I want to highlight, especially relevant for our purposes today. Sitting here with the senior senator from Texas is he also has extensive experience with state government, a former attorney general of Texas, former member of our Texas Supreme Court, member of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and of special relevance for why we're so honored to have this conversation today is his leadership on the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, with so much oversight over our nation's secrets, and then the comportment and disposition and classification and declassification of those secrets. And one other observation I want to make is, you know, from afar, those of us here in Austin, a lot of other Americans, you look at Washington, D.C., and it looks pretty broken and dysfunctional, and that's because it is broken and dysfunctional. You look at Capitol Hill, Congress, and it seems pretty broken and dysfunctional because largely it is. I'm happy to say that Senator John Cornyn stands athwart that dysfunction, and he manages to be both a principled conservative and a genuine deal maker in the best sense of the term. And that's not just rhetoric. Let me just give you a few examples. He partnered with Senator Patrick Leahy, liberal Democrat from Vermont, on FOIA reform, which we've been talking about earlier today. He partnered with Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and Senator Mark Warner, again, both Democrats, on the CHIPS Act, major new initiative designed to help the United States compete with China and secure our semiconductor supply chain. He partnered with Chris Coons, another Democrat of Delaware, on a really innovative use of Lend-Lease authorities to support Ukraine in defending itself and its freedoms from the invasion from Russia. And so insofar as things are actually getting done in the U.S. Senate, you'll rarely find something getting done without Senator John Cornyn in the middle of it. And so it's a real honor to have him here today talking with us about these important issues, but not just as someone who knows them, but someone who's actively making a difference on them. So anyway, thank you for indulging me that fulsome, it needs to be said, especially in our current environment. Okay, all right. So anyway, and he's also really nice to puppies. So, okay. Okay, Senator, let's dive in. Obviously, we have a number of experts here, but also, particularly for some of our locals, may not be fully familiar with the work and responsibilities of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, the SISI. So what can you tell us about your duties, the responsibilities of that committee, especially as it relates to our concerns about transparency and oversight and trust with the intelligence community? So.
Well, the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, which means the leader of both the Democratic and Republican parties, get to select those members. You don't accrue seniority like you would ordinarily, or get to claim, as a matter of right, your service on that committee. You have to be appointed. And of course, they were created along with the HPSI, the House counterpart, in the wake of the Church Committee and the abuses of the intelligence community and intelligence tools. And the desire for more oversight. And if you think about it, the oversight that the committees provide, although we do this in secret, by and large, not in secret when we can do it in public. But along with things like the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, I think are designed to try to provide overlays of oversight that would help build confidence, not only in the public, but also in the Congress itself for providing these tools to the intelligence community to do the important things that I know the D&I talked about last night, particularly things like 702.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we will certainly be coming back to that. All right, so following up then, tell us, obviously we're here because of our concern about declassification and transparency, but there's a flip side to that is the secrecy does matter, and there are national security secrets that do need to be preserved. Tell us why it matters. Tell us a little bit more, if there, even a couple of examples you may want to use about what are the stakes involved in protecting classified information, and what are the bad guys trying to do?
Well, if I could start at first principles, as you mentioned, Will, I've been a big advocate of open government. As a state AG, we had a portfolio which enforced the open meetings and open records laws. And then I did find a partner, a strange bedfellow, in Pat Leahy, but we successfully worked together to expand and make more available information to the public through the Freedom of Information Act. Goes back to first principles again. The legitimacy of government flows from the consent of the governed, and the governed can't consent to something they don't know about. And I've also noticed an all too human propensity to hide stuff that could potentially be embarrassing and to promote stuff that makes me look good. And that's just natural, that's just human nature. So I start from that premise of the public's right to know. It's important to self-government, and that's where we start. But as we all know, there are important matters that need to be handled confidentially and in secret, and hence the classification system. I gave Will a compliment, said this could not be a more timely discussion, given everything that's gone on. But it also, I think, perhaps will lead to what I consider to be some important debates and discussions and potential reforms of the classification system. I checked out on the internet, so it must be true, that roughly 4 million Americans have some level of security clearance. 4 million. Hard for me to imagine that things are very secret if 4 million people potentially have access to it. But as we all know, there are different levels of security clearance. And what I've learned being a member of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence is, frankly, most of it's based on need to know. Mm-hmm. And that's the compartmentalization along together with covert action, special access programs, things like that, which are designed to keep the most critical information secret, primarily to preserve the life of our spies, people who are collecting that information, as well as the sources, which would be jeopardized if this matter got public, if people knew, if certain people in high places or adversaries knew about the source of that information or the means by which we collected it, they would shut it down in a New York minute. So those are the most important. But it is important, I believe, to have, while the intelligence community are, and they will tell you time and time again, and I respect this, they're not policymakers, they're truth tellers. And we expect them to tell us the truth, the good, bad, and the ugly, without any spin, without any agenda. And then we, as the policymakers who are accountable to the American people, we will be the ones that decide what to do with that information in terms of making policy. But we'll get into this, I'm sure. But obviously, the executive branch has ball control on so much of this. But I think it's really important that Congress, representing the American people, provides oversight, which hopefully builds public confidence that these tools will not be abused, but also lets us reauthorize important tools that we can't live without.
Yeah, and we will certainly come to that. But following up on your comment about 4 million Americans holding security clearances, do you think we have an overclassification problem? And related to that, is our declassification system overburdened? So is the system working or not?
Well, I'll refer to a slightly more authoritative source than the internet. And I read in the New York Times this morning, 50 million documents a year are classified. That's mind-boggling. 50 million documents classified. And I don't know if that's single pages or what, boxes of documents. Or that's been subject to some speculation as a result of the news as to what the former presidents and vice president had. But declassification, and I know we've got the Declassification Board here doing important work. Most of the recommendations they've made, unfortunately, have sat on the shelf and have not made their way into changes in public policy, something I'd like to see change, and maybe as a result of this conversation. So one last factoid relevant to this. Again, I'll cite the New York Times that says 671 officials can deem information top secret, 817 who can deem information secret. There's no doubt in my mind that overclassification is a problem. And again, it's a subjective judgment by these classifiers. One last comment along those lines. One of the reasons why perhaps people have become lackadaisical and less than vigilant in protecting classified information is the experience of most members of Congress when you go into a SCIF and you get briefed on, in a secure facility on whatever it is the administration wants to brief you on. And you come out of there saying, I could have watched cable news and read the newspaper and learned as much as they were willing to tell me. Of course, and so they think, well, this is not that big a deal. You say it's secret, but this is not secret. It's open source stuff. Of course, that doesn't speak to the other categories we mentioned earlier where, sources and methods, covert action, special access programs, things like that, which are the most secret of the secret. But I think that's part of why we find ourselves in the strange place we are today.
Yeah. And following up on that, one of the things we've been discussing at the conference, and you and I have talked about before, are the actual benefits that declassification can bring, and making more of these previous U.S. classified U.S. government records available to scholars, to journalists, to policymakers. I mean, we know that it can help with accountability and exposing misdeeds, but particularly as we're thinking about building a bipartisan consensus on this, and of course you're a conservative. Any other benefits that you have seen from making this information more available?
Well, sadly, it occurs a long time after it was classified, and so a lot of it is not really available or timely for discussions about what's happening today. Maybe something happened during the Cold War we learned about and said, well, that's really interesting, from a historical perspective. But occasionally we find ourselves, for example, you mentioned, I think, the Lend-Lease program, which saved Great Britain and where the United States became the arsenal of democracy. Actually, that was a great historical example of how we now have passed a more recent bill providing a Lend-Lease bill that deals with Ukraine and our NATO allies. And trying to figure ways to break through some of the red tape and the bureaucracy when it comes to arming our friends and allies who are fighting the good fight. We're not risking American lives directly, but they're doing things that do positively affect our national security interests. So I just think we have to be a little more nimble. Number one, not overclassify. Number two, once the need to classify goes away, find a way to put that in the public domain. I know that's easier said than done.
And another theme that our conference has addressed is this. I used to say looming avalanche, but now an avalanche that is upon us of electronic records, right? Yeah. Going back, the Reagan presidency was actually the first one to use email, but that, kind of was a little bit of a trickle, but grew into a steady flow in the Clinton years, and then a deluge from Bush 43 on. And we had a panel earlier today talking about the benefits or the potential use of artificial intelligence, machine learning for helping to process just this avalanche. Is there anything that Congress Congress can do in particular to help support the use of technology in addressing the declassification burden, especially in this new era of electronic records?
Well, as you mentioned, the volume of information is just so great that I don't expect that human beings are going to be able to do all that. And so AI is sort of an obvious tool that could be used for that. Again, assuming it's publicly available, which it may or may not be for a long time. I'll have to think about that one a little bit more, but it is certainly a problem, just the sheer volume of information.
I'm sure our PIDB friends would welcome increased appropriation from Congress to study the problem. So anyway,
Well,
look at them greedily sitting here in the front row. They're angling for that. Yeah, that line item.
We'd appreciate their work suggesting legislative language for how we might actually implement such a thing.
That's right. So, yeah. And Senator, our discussions here in the gathering today, of course, it's looking at journalists and scholars and other professionals and this question about classification, declassification. But this also occurs against the backdrop of ongoing threats and challenges in our world, ongoing threats and challenges to American national security. And again, these aren't just abstractions. A lot of the classified documents we're talking about are concerned very much with threats from China, Russia, Iran,
right.
and since we have the chance to have this discussion with you here, I do want to turn to a few of those actual policy issues. I guess let's first start with the really big one of China. I know you've been paying attention to this for a while. You've done some key legislation on it. How would you describe your current understanding of the threat from the Chinese Communist Party, the parts that most concern you? And then, is there hope for bipartisan cooperation in continuing to address it?
Well, President Xi's number one foreign policy objective is reunification with Taiwan. And that threatens not only a regional, but even a global conflict, and something that I believe we need to deter if humanly possible, and we're not ready. We're not close to being ready. But we also, COVID-19 demonstrated the vulnerability of our supply chains writ large. Governor Abbott, when I called him and said, after COVID hit, I said, Governor, what do you need from the federal government? He said, I need two things. I need testing and I need PPE. I said, great. What's PPE? He said, it's masks and gowns. We don't make any of it. It's all made in China, and we can't get enough. And so, and then I began to think a little bit more broadly about things like semiconductors, which I honestly was not an expert in, but worked with my friend Mark Warner, chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, to introduce what we call the CHIPS Act. That was in June of 2020. And it took 2 years for that to come to fruition in legislation. But because of the, I think it's Chris Miller wrote Chip War.
Yeah. We had
excellent book if you haven't read it. But it sort of chronicles the history of, ever since Jack Kilby, at Texas Instruments created the first integrated circuit in 1958, sort of what the role that has played in our economy and now in national security. But one of the biggest concerns that Senator Warner and I had is if because of another pandemic, because of a blockade, because of a natural disaster, if our access to the advanced semiconductors manufactured by Taiwan Semiconductor were cut off, it would be an immediate threat to our economy, and it would be an immediate threat to our national security, given the technology advantage that the United States has over our allies around the world, and the fact that most of our adversaries, China and Russia, use American technology to produce what they use. And we've seen it pretty effectively use the sanctions, for example, on the Russian Federation when it comes to what they're doing in Ukraine, and their denial of access to things they can use to replenish their stocks, and indeed they're running out of a lot of their stuff, and that relies on that technology. So, and then just the fact that, after China joined the World Trade Organization, we had these aspirations that it would become part of the international rules-based order, and it hasn't. In fact, when it comes to technology, they steal everything they can. They through forced technology transfers in terms of foreign investments here and over there. They are getting access to our most cutting-edge dual-use technology, and then of course cyber, which is just a mind-blowing challenge to keep up with. I will say General Nakasone and the people at the National Security Agency are very impressive, but even they are struggling to keep up with the challenges that are faced by cybersecurity threats, from whether it's from the PRC, whether it's from North Korea, Iran, or Russia.
And I want to follow up on something you mentioned at the start of your comments on China, which is the threat to Taiwan. And I know that you've visited Taiwan.
Yes.
Give us your assessment of President Tsai, Taiwan as a country, their capability and willingness to defend themselves. I mean, obviously we're an important partner there, but they're certainly on the front line. So tell us your assessment of Taiwan's posture here and their view of the threat.
Well, I was in Taipei with a group of Senate colleagues, a couple of House colleagues a year ago, November. And we didn't get nearly as much attention as Nancy Pelosi did for some reason. But that was okay. We still got threatened and by the CCP for our going there. They said we were going to start a world war or something. I don't know. It's a lot of bluff and bluster. We have the Taiwan Relations Act. It's not like we're starting from nowhere. But I think under the Taiwan Relations Act, we've committed to providing them the means to defend themselves. And it's an island, and much more difficult than Ukraine has been, for example, to rearm and to defend. And so one of the people whose work I admire on this topic is Elbridge Colby, who you know, who wrote a book called Strategy of Denial. His thesis is we're not ready to fight a two-front battle, one in Ukraine and then one in Asia. And again, you being a Reagan expert, I think we all are hope and pray that the Reagan doctrine prevails, peace through strength and deterrence actually works. But the only thing I think really helping us now as regards Taiwan is I don't think President Xi thinks they're ready yet. But we learned the hard way that one man can make a decision to go like tomorrow. President Putin in Ukraine, President Xi could do the same thing. I'm also hoping and praying that President Xi is learning what President Putin has learned the hard way, which is how the democracies around the world will come together and support countries like Ukraine that have been invaded by the Russian Federation. And indeed, I'm hope he's worried a lot about what Friends of Taiwan will do out of a sense of national security, but also a sense of economic security. I guess, because Taiwan Semiconductor has this great business model because they can build a fab, a manufacturing facility, about 30% less than it takes in the United States. So Morris Chang, who used to be at Texas Instruments, decided, I'm going to build this fab in Taiwan, and then we will not design any semiconductors. We'll just manufacture those made by other designers. Great business model, but it's a huge vulnerability. And so if that were disrupted, that would have huge, huge consequences in addition to all the others you can imagine.
Yeah. And then you've mentioned Ukraine, and we're going to come to that. But one more question related to Asia. Another country that you've shown a lot of leadership on, even with the the India caucus in the U.S. Senate, of course, is India and U.S.-India relations. What role do you see India playing as a partner of the U.S., especially as we're trying to address the challenge from China, but also U.S.-India relations in its own right?
Well, a little known factoid is that Hillary Clinton and I started the U.S.-India caucus in the Senate. And then Chris Dodd became my partner, and then now Mark Warner. In Texas, we have about 500,000 Indian Americans, and usually some of the most successful people in our communities. The great thing about India is it's a democracy. It's the world's largest democracy. and we have those shared values that go along with that. The problem is they become very dependent on the Russians, for example, particularly on their weapons systems, which cause them to abstain from the UN resolution condemning the Russian invasion of Ukraine, something that was a profound disappointment. Senator Warner and I did talk to the ambassador about that and let him know for what it was worth. And but again, on that trip I took with some of my colleagues a year ago last November, we actually ended up in Delhi talking to Prime Minister Modi. And that relationship is very important. Talking to one of the foreign ministers, I happened to mention at lunch, I said, well, one of the things we're concerned about is a Taiwan problem. And he said to me, Senator, we don't have a Taiwan problem, we have a China problem, which I found somewhat encouraging. And of course, they're having these border conflicts with China out in a forsaken part of real estate, but one they both feel very strongly about, and both have lost lives, but are committed to fight. So I think it just is a no-brainer for us to continue to try to develop our relationship with India. I was reassured when the Quad was created, but I also found out when Senator Warner, Senator King, and I, again, all three of us on the Intel Committee were in Australia and New Zealand, that we shouldn't overestimate the willingness of some of our allies to come join us in the fight when the shooting starts, if it starts. Again, my hope and prayer is that it never starts, that deterrence works. But we're not ready yet, and Taiwan's not ready yet, but we better get ready.
Yeah, so, well, and speaking of where the shooting has started, we've alluded to this a couple times, but we're coming up on the one-year anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Again, as I mentioned earlier, you've been a leader, a stalwart in the Senate in providing economic and military assistance to the Ukrainian forces. A few questions in this. Director Haynes, in her comments last night, mentioned America's intelligence support for Ukraine. What role, from where you sit, has American intelligence sharing played in Ukraine's, viability and battlefield successes thus far?
Well, since she mentioned it, I won't worry about divulging anything I shouldn't divulge here.
Yeah,
but
that was my little cue. That's right. So yeah.
But yes, one of the reasons Ukraine has been so effective on identifying targets, Russian targets in Ukraine, has been because of American intelligence sharing, something they didn't have the indigenous capability to do, and which I think has been, if not a game changer, certainly very significant. Declassification, so we've talked about declassification writ large, but that's an example of where it could have meaningful and direct impact on success or failure on the battlefield.
And following up on Ukraine, then, what is your assessment of the current state of the conflict? That we're coming one year in, and then obviously no one can predict the future. But what are you going to be looking for over the next several months as far as indicators of which direction it might go?
Well, this has been a disaster for Putin and the Russian Federation. But having said that, Putin's not going to give up, and I think he's going to continue to try to grind the Ukrainians and to grind the coalition of democracies that are supporting Ukraine. The United States is famous for its fatigue after a while when it comes to supporting these conflicts, and obviously the concern is that there will be and you've already heard some of the voices in Congress saying, why should we spend money on this when we can spend money in the United States on X, Y, and Z? I believe this is money well spent. We're not losing any American lives in this conflict, and the Ukrainians are degrading the ability of the Russians to do what they're doing. Although, again, I don't underestimate Putin's willingness to sacrifice his own people and their economy and their future in pursuit of his ideological goal of restoring the Russian Empire. But it's, and I worry that, some voices here in America say, well, we want to force the Ukrainians to negotiate a deal. But I think we all know in our heart of hearts that if Zelensky were to cut a deal with the Russians today, then the next year or so would be used to replenish and restock Russian munitions and weapons so they could then continue their aggression against their neighbors in Europe. So I'm glad to say there is a broad bipartisan support in the Congress, and I think it's important not only for people who question the expenditure of tax funds for this purpose, but also those of us who believe it's important to speak up so the public can be better informed about what's at stake. Again, it's not costing American blood. No troops are losing their life in this battle, but the Russian, one of the premier aggressive countries in the world is gradually losing their ability to wage war.
All right, one more question from me before we turn to a few from students here in the audience. And again, this is going to be referencing something that Director Haynes also brought up last night, which is Section 702. So for those not familiar, shortly after the 9/11 attacks, as the United States was gearing up our counterterrorism apparatus, Congress passed some legislation with a number of new tools for surveillance and detection of terrorist threats, and this included something called Section 702, which, as Director Haynes shared last night, has also been of great use not only in detecting potential terrorist attacks, but also helping monitor the threat from Russia and China. But she made an appeal, and I guess I'm passing on her message to you, is she would love it if Congress would reauthorize this because it is it's otherwise going to expire at the end of this year. So tell us what Section 702 actually entails and why you support reauthorizing it and would like to see Congress do that.
Well, Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, and I'll underline the word foreign. This is to gain intelligence on foreign actors and threats, not domestic. Domestic investigations are subject to the Constitution of the United States and the Bill of Rights, require heightened standards in front of an impartial judge before you can do some of the things that Section 702 and other aspects of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act allow us to do in the national security interests overseas. And so that's a really, really important thing for people to understand. But as a result of some of the concerns about, let's be honest, some of the abuses of these tools, and just frankly, good old all-American skepticism about what people are doing and that they don't know about, that they suspect are up to no good, there's a lot of skepticism in Congress about reauthorizing these tools. One of the other parts of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act that we were unable to reauthorize about a year or so ago was called Section 215. Strangely enough, Section 215, all it does is provide the intelligence community basic law enforcement tools which are available to every police department and every law enforcement officer in America, but to use it in pursuit of our national security against foreign actors. But 702, given the fact that we, American technology and the backbone of a lot of the means by which we communicate today are available using this tool. This has allowed us to do everything from target Zawahiri and take him out. Of course, what we've encouraged the intelligence community to do is give us some success stories using 702 in great power competition. Again, this goes against the grain because if you're a spook, you don't believe in telling people what you're doing, right? But from a policymaker's perspective, we have to know some of these success stories that can be appropriately declassified so we can make the case, something we get to see in a classified setting, but which many policymakers do not and the American people do not. So the only way we're going to be able to do this is if we can demonstrate that they're going to be used appropriately with appropriate oversight. But 702 is what variously described as the crown jewels of the intelligence community. I think Director Haynes may have, I think she said last night, we can't do our job without it. That ought to get our attention. And so we have a long road ahead of us, I believe, to working with the IC, the intelligence community, to try to work with them to declassify some examples of its success, to demonstrate its relevance and importance, but also to reassure my colleagues in Congress that these tools will not be abused. And if they are, then people will be held accountable for it. That's the only way we're going to get this done.
Yeah. All right. Well, since I am sitting here with the great deal maker in the Senate, can you give us any prognosis on how optimistic are you about getting it reauthorized? And I know you laid out some of the parameters there of hopefully getting some declassification success stories. But
well, it's kind of like the debt ceiling.
Mm-hmm. Oh boy. Okay.
There is no plan B.
Okay.
There is no plan B. We have to do it, and it may be that in the context of what we're talking about today and some of the discussions we're having, in light of the overclassification, the fact that there's a lot of people, probably too many people, who can actually authorize classification of documents and the declassification process, I think we can have part of a larger conversation that 702 can be a piece of, to provide some reassurance that we're being responsive to concerns that have been raised, but also insistent that there are some tools which are should be non-negotiable.
All right. Okay, in our remaining time, I'm going to turn to a few questions submitted by our students, including a few that you met with privately beforehand, but they didn't get a chance to ask these then. So the first one comes from Austin Montgomery. He's a senior studying international relations and global studies. I mentioned he's pursuing the private sector job. And his question is this. Senator Cornyn, since you're currently the ranking member on the Subcommittee for International Trade and Global Competitiveness, what do you think America needs to do to become more competitive on the global stage, especially in the area of international trade?
Well, when President Obama was in office, he proposed the Trans-Pacific Partnership. You're familiar with that. And sadly, Congress did not follow through and pass that Trans-Pacific Partnership. This is particularly important now when it comes to China, which is taking a more aggressive role in the region and trying to fill that void left by the United States, non-participation in these multilateral trade agreements. And in a trip I made to Japan with Senator Haggerty, former ambassador to Japan, and Ben Cardin, every single government official we met with in Japan said, can we get back to the TPP? Tom Carper from Delaware, who's my ranking, we've traded off, we've either been ranking member or chairman of the Trade Subcommittee of the Senate Finance Committee. We've written a number of op-ed pieces and spoken publicly together that we need to get back to these trade agreements, because that is a source of cohesion, but it's also a source of great strength in the region at a time when we need it, and when we know that the PRC is taking advantage of our failure to get our act together. So I'm a big believer that countries that trade together are less likely to fight one another, and so it's a no question a good thing and something we need to continue back to. I'm a little concerned. I don't think the Biden administration considers this a priority right now, but we tend to keep pushing and keep advocating for something along those lines.
Yeah, it's often been said that especially in Asia, trade policy is foreign policy. So, yeah,
I believe it.
Yeah. All right, our next question concerns the CHIPS Act. This comes from Kashav Sharma, a junior who is an electrical engineering major, so certainly knows the topic. What is your opinion on how the Biden administration is starting to implement the CHIPS Act? And particularly, how do you think that they should balance building R&D and manufacturing capabilities at home versus nearshoring facilities?
Well, getting back to the supply chain issue on advanced semiconductors, this was the response. The CHIPS Act was the response Congress made to provide financial incentives to semiconductor manufacturers to build in America or build in friendly places. And China certainly understands their vulnerability when it comes to these supply chains as well, and is trying to figure that out, as Chris Miller talks about in his book, Chip War. But part of it has to do with, it's not just providing the financial incentives for these companies like TSMC, Samsung, Micron, and others to build in America. It's also about export controls. And I must say, Secretary Raimondo, the Secretary of Commerce, has been a great partner to work with. One of the things that the Commerce Department has issued a number of export controls on some of this critical technology to make sure that China does not get access to it, if possible. But of course, they're very shrewd and they tend to find workarounds wherever they can. But this is where, as I mentioned earlier, Hal Brand's comment in his book, Danger Zone, where he talks about this analog back in the Cold War, where the democracies of the world band together on basically voluntary export controls to communist countries, but bringing that forward, using that same sort of consortium of technologically advanced countries to band together on export controls to prevent China from getting access to the most advanced technology. This is our advantage, and it's because we have a robust and innovative and creative private sector. We don't, the federal government's not good at innovation. It's terrible at innovation. Usually is an obstacle to innovation. But this is an area where I think there's a role for the government to play to encourage that in the defense of our economy and national security.
Well, and I can't resist asking a follow-up since we are here in Texas. You're representing, of course, our great state, and Texas is certainly a player in semiconductors, including UT. Do you anticipate any of the CHIPS Act resources flowing here to Texas?
Absolutely.
Okay, good.
If I have anything to do about it, I will.
Okay.
And it's a strong bipartisan delegation that's advocating for that.
So absolutely great. All right, well, we've got time for just one more question, and I'm actually going to do a consolidated version. 3 different students, Chris Dictus, Kyle Balzer, Mara Sherry, all asked different versions of the same question. I think this will tell you a lot about our current, the younger generation's concerns, which is the possibilities you see of true bipartisanship in foreign policy and national security. And of course, we gave some examples of some work that you've done there, but there still is obviously some pretty fevered partisan divides in our country. So what does it take going forward, do you think, to forge true, meaningful bipartisan consensus on foreign policy?
Well, I think you're right. We have talked about a number of bipartisan efforts, whether it's a support for our Ukrainian friends against Russian invasion. That's been broad bipartisan support, whether it's the response to China, the technology response, and support for countries like Taiwan. So one of the problems today, and maybe it's always been a problem, is the only thing that makes news is when there are conflict and disagreements. But when we're working together, it doesn't make news, so people don't pay much attention to it. But I want to assure you that there are those in Congress, and I would say the vast majority of members of Congress who actually do try to find ways to work together in the best interests of the country and their constituents. And that the folks that like to appear on cable news or are very active in social media and just complain about the other side of an argument are in a pretty small minority. So I'm actually pretty optimistic. But part of what we found today, or we see today, is this tendency, and I don't want to overstep my bounds here, where there are some people in the academic world that like to shut down anybody who they disagree with, or they want to be protected from hearing things that offend them or they disagree with, which to me is sort of the diametrically opposite of what I thought college and higher education was supposed to be about, being exposed to a wide variety of views. But one of the things I've come to believe is the importance of not shrinking from the fight. When people say things, for example, like, and I think well-meaning things like, why should we spend any money in Ukraine? If there's nobody there making the case for why this is in the best interest of the United States from a national security perspective, then people they can be forgiven for believing the only side of the argument they hear. So this is another reason why we need broad access to information, and we need people who have the courage to stand up and say what they believe. And the American people, I trust, will always make the right decision if given that complete information.
Amen to that. All right, a great note to end on. Please join me in thanking Senator John Cornyn. That was fantastic. Thank you so much. So, yeah. All right. And I know you've got and we've got a 15-minute